A common question that I get asked, and it's another thing I've seen debated high and low on the internet, is what's the best tank in history? And everyone on the internet will say that the criteria for being the best tank ever is that none of them were ever destroyed. Well, if that's the case, there can be only one. The Bob Semple tank. Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a model showcase video for this 1/72nd scale New Zealand Bob Semple tank. The model that you see here is built for my own personal collection and is not for sale and or purchase. However, like I often mention in my build videos, I often take on commission build projects from models ranging between 1/35th scale and 1/6 scale. This model here, being 1/72nd, is not a scale that I offer any build services in. However, if anyone is interested for the scales that I do offer builds in, I can be reached via the email address listed below, which is info@eastcoastarmory.com. This model here is built totally out of the box, or I should say out of the bag, and you'll know exactly what I'm referring to as the video goes on. And on that note, in this video we're going to be giving the model a thorough in-box or in-bag review, and I'll be touching upon all the features and details that are found on this model in order to bring it up to the condition that we have here. So stay tuned, because there's going to be a little bit of content coming right at you. To start this video off, let's go ahead and take a quick walk around this model. And this vehicle, second to only maybe the Tonk, is the ultimate in meme machines. This is the one, the only, the Bob Semple tank. Memes aside, the Bob Semple tank is actually a very interesting tank design in its own right. This vehicle was designed by New Zealand during probably their darkest period in World War II. In the late 1930s and into the early 1940s, the New Zealanders were coming to the realization that a war with Japan was probably going to be inevitable. When they looked at their military equipment and hardware, they came to the really bad realization that their equipment was heavily antiquated. And so the New Zealand military rushed in order to acquire new military equipment from their allies, but if not, they were going to also try to convert as much civilian hardware as possible into a military format. This became a much more pressing issue when in 1941, the war officially started with Japan, and the threat of being, invaded by the Japanese was something that was very, very plausible, if not almost inevitable. Because of the very real risk of there being a land invasion of New Zealand, the New Zealand forces really were going to need some sort of armored vehicles. And unfortunately for them, they really didn't have any at the time. So they went ahead and tried to look at whatever piece of civilian equipment that they could make do and turn into their own tank. This needs to be something that can easily be done, and it's something that they have lots of available candidates for, that they could just take and up armor and up gun as quick as possible. One tracked vehicle that was going to be a really good candidate and was a vehicle that was in great numbers on the island was the Caterpillar D8 crawler and Bulldozer. The Cat is an extremely good machine. It's reliable and is one that's very powerful, but it's obviously intended to be used as a bulldozer or a crawler. When the design staff saw this vehicle, they went ahead and heavily modified it, keeping basically the engine, the transmission, and the suspension, and building an armored cabin around it. Another issue that the designers had to overcome was the scarcity of materials that were going to produce high-grade armor steel plate. In order to have the vehicle be up armored, the designers came up with this solution where the plating was going to be somewhat on the thinner end. However, they were going to clad it with a corrugated sections of steel. The corrugated steel was theorized to give better armor protection compared to just a standard flat plate, because the facets of the corrugations would have the effect of deflecting incoming rounds. Also, with the types of armament that the Japanese had at the time, this armor protection was deemed to be adequate. For armament, the vehicle was going to utilize 6 3-of-3 chambered Bren guns, and one of which was going to be mounted in a revolving turret. The other MGs were going to be mounted in pivoting ball mounts scattered along the various sections of the vehicle sides. Of course, the reason why this tank is known as the Bob Semple tank is because Mr. Bob Semple was the man in charge with designing an indigenous tank design for New Zealand, and he was part of the design staff that came up with this vehicle. The vehicle was eventually completed and submitted to the New Zealand military. Upon receiving it, they came to the quick notion that it's actually pretty terrible. The D8 is an excellent machine. However, when you try to shoehorn it into the role of a tank, it doesn't really work all that well. The Bob Semple tanks never went into production and also never saw combat because, well, New Zealand was never invaded by the Japanese, thankfully. And here's the model at the start of the project. For the base starter kit, I'll be utilizing this 3D printed Bob Semple tank kit. This model here I procured from shapeways.com, and the link to this particular example can be found in the video description listed below. This model is a really new addition to the stash. I, of course, picked it up from shapeways.com, and generally at this point in the video I would go into the background on the kit's history. However, for this one here, that's not really something I'm going to be able to do because I don't know when this particular artist uploaded or added this kit to the marketplace. So unfortunately, that information I'm not going to be able to mention. I will say that this model here retailed anywhere between about 40 or 50 some odd US dollars. So it's a bit expensive for a 1/72nd scale solid 3D printed model, but again, the subject matter, it kind of lends itself to that. Also, at this point of the video, I would talk about the model's graphic design and the box art, but as you can see with this one, this is what you get because Shapeways. So with that out of the way, let's just go ahead and talk about the model in question. So after opening up the box and dumping out the kit contents, here we have the model in question. The one thing that I do want to mention about Shapeways is that when you're ordering something like this from them, you have several options of materials that are available. You have the standard white nylon material that we have here, and then we also have what I refer to as HD, which is a 3D printed resin material. The 3D printed resin is more conducive for finely molded, or I should say integrally printed on details. However, this does come with a cost. That material is much more expensive compared to the standard counterpart. However, on this kit over here, I offered to pay a couple bucks extra for the white nylon material that has an extra procedure done to it. You see, Shapeways within the last year or so, they added this new option where it's called polished. And what this does is that they take the standard white nylon material and they do something to it in order to smooth out the surface texture, making it much along the lines as the HD stuff, where you get by and large the quality of the HD resin prints, but for a price tag that is much lower. And for this example here, I figured it would be something that would be greatly appreciated. And on a Bob Semple tank, because of the corrugated side plates over here, as well as some of the other nooks and crannies found on the suspension, I think it's definitely a wise choice to option for. So from there, this takes us to basically the kit contents, which, as you can see, it's pretty much already assembled. The only thing that is not attached to the hull is the turret over here, which is held in place with this integrally printed on stem. This is something that obviously needs to be snipped away, and then once you remove that material, the turret can just drop into place, and you could probably just position it to any way you deem fit. The model is completely solid. It's not hollow or anything. It has a little bit of heft to it, which is something that's really good, actually. You want to have some weight to your model so it sits on the terrain, and it just feels for a more higher quality piece as opposed to something that's really paper thin. As for the integral printed on details, well, hopefully this comes out on camera, but the little side corrugated panel should be coming out in frame. You can see it has some panels on these three sections. But the real detailing on the Bob Semple is definitely the transmission and the suspension, because this is a cat, bulldozer. You are going to have lots of little rollers and other little gizmos going on down here, and the artists who designed this really did a pretty decent job with rendering all of this equipment out found on this example. He even went ahead and integrally printed on the little support struts that are found on these spots and sections. The tracks are a bit plain. He doesn't have the little rivets that would be found that connect the metal track pad to the inner chain, but again, it is 1/72nd scale, so this is something that I could easily live with. The front portion over here, you can see the visor, some machine guns. One of the machine guns here appears to be broken, but I think this might be it right here on the table, and I'm going to put that back in the bag so I can repair that during the production. This material does super glue pretty well, so if you have a broken piece like that, it could easily just be repaired without any problems. And that's really all there is to it. These are very simple models, and it's really all depends on how the individual paints it. So let's go ahead and cut across when this thing is fully completed. Starting with the model suspension, there's really nothing to mention detail-wise because, again, it was all integrally printed as one piece. Where this model really comes into its own is not necessarily with the assembly of the details, but it's with the way the model is fully painted and weathered. Because the suspension is a Caterpillar D8 suspension, you want to go about painting it slightly different compared to the way you would on a normal tank. First, there's no rubber cladding anywhere on the tracks. It's totally just steel on steel. And also, unlike tanks that just feature standard steel tracks where there's some kind of an oxide finish on them to prevent sort of, the tracks from rusting or weathering. On the Cats, that's just not the case. The Cat tracks are just painted with the same paint that the remainder of the vehicle is in. So on this one over here, I just went ahead and painted the tracks with the same color as the base coat, which on this one is Tamiya olive green. The remainder of the paintwork is done via the dry brushing, and that's done with some silver paint that was dry brushed into the areas that you see here because these tracks, if anyone has ever looked at a real bulldozer, will scratch very, very quickly with not a whole lot of actual usage. Also, while on the suspension, one thing that stuck out to me that was a change that Bob Semple made to this version of his tank that deviated from the original Caterpillar design was that he went ahead and altered the design here of the front idler system. With the way the original D8 was, the idler was much larger in size, and basically the track is primarily just flat and it curves upward. Because this vehicle needed to actually go off-road and overcome certain obstacles, he went ahead and redesigned the suspension with a smaller idler wheel, so now that the track actually has an incline to it, which would make it better suited for those type of applications. One slight mod that I did make to this model, however, involves the tow hitch found on the back. The piece was integrally printed solid, so with the help of a Dremel and a Dremel bit, I simply just bored it out, giving you the detailing that you see here. And that's all of the actual modding that I've done to the model as a whole. Back to the remainder of the model, now that it's fully painted and weathered, you really get to appreciate the quality of the surface texturing that I was touching upon earlier. If you look closely, you'll see that there are no print lines that are really visible, and the piece really does look like something that was either a resin cast unit or possibly something that was made with injection molded polystyrene. Back to the small details, this brings us to all of the MGs that are just littered all over this vehicle. After looking at the pictures of the real Bob Semple tank closely, you'll see that the MG balls are only painted on the front portion, and you can see white shiny metal on the areas where the thing pivots inside of its pivoting mechanism. On the model here, I went ahead and replicated that by just taking some silver paint and very carefully painting the areas around the center portion. This way, it gives you the look that is present on the actual units seen in the various photographs of this vehicle in tests, as well as also in a parade. The remainder details would include some periscopes. All of the periscopes on this vehicle on the hull and turret are thoroughly painted. I use gloss black, as I generally mentioned, and one trick that I do is to add a little bit more sheen. I use Tamiya gloss black, I let it set, and then I go over it again with Tamiya gloss lacquer. This adds an extra bit of shine to the prisms, and it's a technique that yields for some pretty good results. On the turret itself, of course, it is able to fully rotate, and it's still fully removable. You'll notice that on the inside portion of both of these sections, there's a small little hole. This was done for painting. Basically, how I paint this model was I drill a hole in the center of these areas, I stick a piece of wire into these holes, and that'll allow me to then suspend the model so I could get the unit thoroughly primed and painted. Masking tape was used to conceal these areas because I don't want paint built up in those locations because it can easily inhibit the turret and it'll make rotating a bit stiffer and harder to do. And this is actually pretty relevant because if the piece is stiffer, you have to put more force on it, which means you're touching the turret stronger, and after a while the paint will wear off quickly compared to just having the piece on in a slightly looser manner. And this takes us to the paint. For the model's paint work, fortunately there is a color photograph of the Bob Semple tank, so trying to come up with the colors was relatively easily done. However, there is a debate out there on how many colors are actually used on the camo pattern. Some claim it's 3, some claim it's 2. From my limited research on the subject matter, the pictures I saw clearly show a 2-tone camouflage pattern. The colors utilized are Tamiya olive green for the base coat and then Tamiya black green for the camo. The camo in this one was all done via the airbrush, as was the remainder of the weathering, which would include the filtering as well as the washing. The remainder of the weathering work was done with Tamiya panel line accent, which, by the way, for this model here is going to be your best friend because it just gets into all those little nooks and crannies, really highlighting them, making it look like a really nice piece. And I used just dry brushing for the remainder of the weathering that you see on this build. As for markings, well, there are none. So we could just, put a pin in that right now. And in the end, it's a nice addition to my collection. The Bob Semple tank was one that I've always had lots of requests for over the years, and finally getting it off the to-do list and presented for all of you on YouTube is now something that does feel really good. The vehicle itself, it's an interesting footnote in armor development history. The tank is certainly famous now. Oddly enough, it's more famous now than it was back when the thing was actually built and developed. But, that's how pop culture and the internet works. The model itself is going to fit right into my smaller scale tank collection, although I don't actively pursue 1/72nd scale. It is something that I dabble in here or there, and this one here was definitely a vehicle that I don't regret purchasing and adding to the collection. One more thing to add was that this was a really insanely quick build. The entire build was concluded in about 3 hours. Really, the thing that took the most amount of time was waiting for the paints and the varnishes to dry. Outside of that, the build was ridiculously quick, which is something that you don't really see a lot these days, for better or for worse. And this slides us into skill level and recommendations. This model here is extremely simple to put together, as is there's just one component, the turret, that needs to be removed off of the sprue and plucked onto the hull in order to complete the construction. Because of that, anyone can put this thing together, from the person that has just touched a plastic model for the first time to the person that has an entire house full of them. Even though this model is really simplistic in terms of building, the one aspect of the build that the builder really needs to pay attention to is with the paint and the weathering. With the way the model is designed and how it's executed with the 3D prints, the detailing is all there, but you need to be very careful and meticulous on how you paint and weather it in order to bring it out to its full potential. If you take your time and are very careful with the paint application as well as with the weathering application, this will really yield for some excellent results with this kit over here. And that's really all there is to it in that regard, so let's pivot to recommendations. This model here is highly recommended for anyone who is an avid fan of the Bob Semple tank. This tank here does have a cult following to it. It's meme magic after all, and because of that, if you are really into this vehicle, this kit here is highly recommended. This model I would also recommend for anyone who is a fan of New Zealand armor or are interested in Pacific World War II theater armor as well. I could also see someone who's an avid small-scale tank fan being into these models over here. If you're the person that collects 1/72nd or 1/76 scale tank models, the addition of this particular kit would be one that is very welcome. Another person who is similar in regards to the one I just mentioned would be someone who's into wargaming. This model here just screams out wargaming with the way the model is designed. If anyone is into that hobby or has seen kits designed for that hobby, the execution of this one here is very similar, where basically the entire model is one integral cast piece. In the past would have been resin or metal, but these days 3D printing has definitely stepped up to fulfill that niche. And with the way the model's executed, where it's very minimalistic with the parts number, this would easily fit into that type of person's collection without any problems. The only thing I do want to hazard against, though, is the model is somewhat costly in that if you're looking to acquire a number of them, the cost of these models here does add up pretty quickly, but this may or may not be something that the type of person who's into wargaming might consider. The one person who I would not recommend this kit to would be someone that's looking for a complex build. This is something that sounds a little strange. However, I've had people contact me in the past asking me this exact question, where they want to purchase a model, but they want to have their money be put into something that is a bit of a challenge, or it's something that's going to take a bit of time to undertake. This build here may not be to your liking. The kit itself is about $50 some odd, and I was able to complete the build in about 10 seconds. So, if you're looking for something to take up an hour or possibly multiple hours of time with the build, with the detailing, and with the paint work, this particular example here is probably not something for your interest. And the last person who I'd recommend this kit to would be anyone who's an avid fan and collector of Caterpillar crawlers and bulldozers, because at the end of the day, the Bob Semple tank is nothing more than a cladded up and roided up Cat D8. If you're a aficionado of those type of vehicles, this one here would easily make a very unique addition to your collection. And with that, that wraps up this model showcase video for this 1/72nd scale Bob Semple tank. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel, where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being small scale model showcase videos like this one over here, or the other larger scale project update videos that frequently get posted to this channel. Another way to keep in the loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There I have more photographs of this particular build, as well as the other smaller and larger scale videos that have been published on this channel in the past. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks again, and I'll be seeing you all again on the next one. Till then.